and welcome to B Shifter. I'm your host, John Vance. So glad to have you along today. Our special guest is Daniel Madrzykowski. And if you know Dan, he is the Director of Research for UL's Fire Safety Research Institute. He has a PhD in fire engineering from the University of Canterbury and an MS in fire protection engineering from the University of Maryland. 32 years of experience, and Dan is a member of the NFPA and serves on committees for fire service training, structural firefighting, and fire investigations. Today, Dan's going to catch us up with what's been going on at FSRI, and we'll talk about some trends and some studies that we're looking forward to getting more information on. Also on today's podcast, we've got Nick Brunacini, Josh Bloom, and Jeffrey King. So without further ado, let's start talking to Dan Madrzykowski. Daniel Madrzykowski, thanks for being here as the Director of Research for UL's Fire Safety Research Institute. Also here we have Jeff, Nick, and Josh. And today we're going to get a little update from Dan on what's going on with FSRI and some of the latest experiments, including the latest search and rescue project. So maybe we can start there. And thanks so much for being here today, Dan. It's really good to see you.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. As you may know, FSRI, although our initials stayed the same, our name has changed during the past year. We went from being the Firefighter Safety Research Institute to just the Fire Safety Research Institute. And that doesn't mean we're changing our core mission about educating the fire service with the goal of better fireground decisions and reducing losses to both the communities the fire service serves, as well as the firefighters themselves. But we broadened the scope of what we're studying. So you may have seen some reports that have come out with regard to a near miss on battery energy storage systems from an incident that occurred in Surprise, Arizona. Well, we've continued that research to try to understand better ways of mitigating that hazard, basically how to fight that fire. Likely next year, that's going to extend into electric vehicles. UL and FDNY and NFPA are sponsoring a symposium on lithium-ion batteries that's coming up in September. Basically looking at the hazard, what do we identify as the hazard as engineers? What are the fire service seeing as the hazard in the street, both to them and to the public? And how do we reduce that hazard? FDNY noticed specifically with small EVs like e-scooters and e-bikes that they went last year from maybe having one fire a month to now having multiple fires a week. And a number of the fires over the course of the past year have become deadly, a few including multiple fatalities. People in apartment buildings tend to charge the scooters in their doorway in front of their only exit from the building and from their apartment. And as a result, once that goes into thermal runaway, either due to a damaged battery that's charging or a mismatched battery and a mismatched charger, that blocks their exit and certainly makes it a challenge. One of the protocols that FDNY has changed is they now call hazmat on every one of those fires so that hazmat can do a better job of wrapping up the battery basically after the initial fire is out and making sure that it can be transported safely out of the building without reigniting. So there's a lot of new challenges there that we're trying to address. Wildland urban interface fires, which in large part, many of the catastrophic ones that we've seen with hundreds of people's homes destroyed, when you really look at them, while they may have started in the wildland, they're really suburban fires, building to building fire spread. So we're doing some examination with regard to that, looking at various windows that they're calling out in the wildland code in California to see what the benefit of those windows are. So that work is continuing on into October, November this year. We'll be running more of those experiments. We branched out into fire investigation or fire research, I should say, for fire investigators. both in terms of things that we documented or discovered in our ventilation tactics research with regard to flow paths and how the energy can move through a building. We're now applying that to how the impact of ventilation can change fire patterns and trying to document the repeatability of that. We're also looking at the chemical and the particulate exposure post-fire to fire investigators. And that technology we're currently using for training fires to look at chemical exposures to firefighters during training fires. So we've completed a series of experiments in the fire behavior lab scenario, i.e. the flashover simulator. And next month, we'll be doing some experiments with MIFRI, the Maryland Fire Rescue Institute, in one of their Class A training buildings, looking at what the exposures are from different fuel loads, which include pallets, pallets and plywood, pallets and oriented strand board, pallets and a lightweight wood fiber board. It's used for acoustic insulation, really. And let's see, particle board, plywood. I think I've got them all. So we're trying to look at and see, do they burn differently? Do they give off different carcinogens when they burn? And how would that impact firefighters that are in there getting the live fire training? And then we'll be providing that information to NFPA 1403, hopefully next year. We certainly got a lot of things that we've been doing. Most recently, we just did some quick fires trying to fill in some gaps. We've done a lot of work on structural collapse. And what we found is that if you have a lightweight structure, whether it's a unprotected steel bar joist or whether it's a lightweight engineered lumber wood eye joist or a parallel cord truss or something like that, once they're exposed to fire, they can lose their structural integrity very quickly, within a matter of minutes. And so as a result of a number of tests that we've done, going back to 2008, 2010, 2012 kind of time period, we've got some concerns in there, or tactical considerations that we provided, that the building can collapse within your operational time frame, i.e. you don't have a safe 20 minutes to operate. So you need to size up and you need to evaluate what you have. And one of the things that becomes challenging with the modern construction methods, meaning plywood subfloor or oriented strand subfloor with tongue and groove, is that the lightweight structure underneath will fail, will lose its structural integrity before the subfloor burns through. As a result, sounding is not a reliable method for saying you can operate on that floor. So the general suggestion has been that you do not operate on a lightweight floor assembly if you have active fire underneath. That is a extremely high risk scenario. That said, we continue to get questions which kind of indicate, well, we need to go in, we need to do that. So what can we do to protect ourselves? And we look at thermal imaging cameras. The thermal imaging camera cannot tell you about the structural integrity of the floor, but it certainly can tell you if there's some heat beneath you. It won't tell you the accurate temperature of that heat beneath you, because we could have a post flashover scenario under the floor and the thermal imager could only be recording 100 degrees at the top of the floor, because the floor is a really good insulator. But if it shows you a contrast or a thermal difference that indicates that you've got heat under you, that's the red flag to stop, right? Further evaluation is needed before you go forward. So we've been running some experiments, just a couple last week, and we're going to run a few more next week, to try to show the difference in the mode of failure between buildings that were built with solid wood joists and 1x6 subfloors and buildings that have been built since the 1970s anyway, with lightweight construction, whether it's a wood eye joist or whether it's a parallel cord truss, lightweight steel that has the sheet goods, either plywood, tongue and groove plywood, or OSB on top. And so the one we burned the other day, what it shows is that the web of the wood eye joist goes away within a few minutes of being exposed to the fire. And the oriented strand board floor is still largely intact. Less than an eighth of an inch of the 3/4 inch board is burned away. As a result, when the firefighter comes in and strikes the floor with their tool, it's going to sound good. It's going to sound okay. And in fact, we had one of our firefighters take a 5-foot hook and strike it repeatedly until they could sense that it was either breaking through or something was happening. And it took several very hard strikes, nothing that would just be the tapping, if you will, or sounding normal strikes, but over the shoulder full swings to get some sense that, yeah, we could break through that floor. Whereas with the 1x6s, basically with the same burn time, the 1x6s, the subfloor goes away before the joists go away. So if the firefighter is standing on the 2x10s or the 2x12s, they're still solid. They'll hold their weight. But if they strike the floor, the 1x6s will break away very quickly. And they'll have an indication that, hey, this floor's been damaged. And we need to change our thoughts about going in further. So it's the structure goes away, but the indicators that you need to sense that with the modern floor system are not there. So we're going to do another burn to further exemplify that. Then we'll be coming out with some information to try to build on tactical considerations that we've had out there for 10 years to try to help people get a better understanding of what to expect on the fire ground and how to treat it. Sadly, as you know, in Maryland, over the past 4 years, we've had a couple of line of duty deaths that are within about 30 miles of our office. And both of them were the result of firefighters going through the floor. Those two line of duty deaths, I don't know if you're familiar with them. Captain Laird in Frederick County about a year ago, and Nate Flynn in Howard County. I believe it's 4 years ago now. Both of the fires started due to a lightning strike. The lightning energy from the lightning followed a pipe that was feeding propane to the buildings. At the terminus, there were corrugated stainless steel tubing feeding appliances. In one case, feeding a fireplace. In another case, feeding a fireplace and a gas range. And the energy burns a hole through the CSST and starts a fire. Usually these fires get a pretty good head start on the fire department before they arrive. In the Nate Flynn case, I believe it was over a half hour before the occupants that were in the home smelled smoke and called the fire department. So the fire was going at least 40 minutes prior to fire department arrival. In the Frederick County case, the fire happened during the daytime. No one was home. And the fire was well involved, flames out the windows of the first floor of the structure prior to fire department arrival. But in both cases, there was a member from each department that had made entry late into the fire for some different reasons, one for suppression and one for investigation, if you will. And both ended up in the basement and sadly couldn't be rescued in time. So, I mean, those are just two examples. There are many more of firefighters going through the floor, and we've got to do a better job of educating our firefighters so they can make some better decisions. Another program that we've got we're pretty active in right now, our near miss program. We got a grant from DHS and a blessing from NIOSH to conduct some near miss studies. So the Surprise, Arizona one is kind of unique at this moment anyway, with regard to the battery energy storage system. We just released a report, I believe last month, on a near miss in LaGrange, Georgia. That That story is interesting. It's a small home built around 1900. When it was originally built, it was a duplex. Each part of the home was a 16 by 16-foot room. It was added onto in later years. So a bathroom and a kitchen were put on the back of the home, and the home was turned into, instead of a duplex, a single family house. The home had some highly combustible exterior finish. It had asphalt siding on it. It was not in the best repair. Something that was interesting about the construction method from 1900 is that the ceiling and the walls were composed of wooden beadboard, which, needless to say, over the past 120 years have been painted over and over and over again. So we had a very fuel-rich interior finish, if you will. And when the firefighters did their size up, they saw that there were flames extending out of the kitchen window of the home on the CD corner, if you will. And there was an interior corner. The fire was coming out of the kitchen window. The kitchen didn't extend all the way to the D side of the house. It stopped short. And as a result, there was a window that was open to the front room of the house, also on the CD corner. So that window was getting auto exposed by the fire coming out of the kitchen window. When the firefighters made their lap, they looked at it and thought, if we go in the front door, we've got a straight shot to the kitchen. But they didn't. When they opened the front door, they ended up in a bedroom. They had to go to the left and go into a living room and then go to the rear of the house. This whole house is less than 1,000 square feet, and then travel to the rear of the house to get to the kitchen where the fire was. As the fire had been burning in the kitchen for some period of time, it's starting to degrade the beadboard walls and starting to burn into the void spaces. Flame continues to extend outside, and there was flame extension into the attic. The firefighters made their entry. They knocked down the fire pretty quickly, at least the fire that they could see in the kitchen. And as they report, they were standing up. There were 4 firefighters in there. They thought everything was good. And then they get a call on the radio from Incident Command that if you can't change the situation in about 30 seconds, you've got to get out of there. So what did Incident Command see that was different from what the firefighters' interior saw? Incident Command saw flames coming out of the front door where they had made entry and extending under the porch, the front porch. The radiant heat from the flames extending under the front porch burnt their hose line through. So now the crew interior has no water. Their response out was that basically they think they've got fire overhead. Can somebody bring them a hook? And then about 20 seconds after that, they were calling maydays. The incident commander was making the right calls in terms of trying to get a second line advance to the house. It just wasn't happening fast enough to prevent the burn injuries, but it did happen. The firefighters inside maintained excellent situational awareness. One firefighter got into the bathroom, closed the door, isolated himself from the fire, manipulated his SCBA in such a way that he was able to get out a very small window. Another firefighter went, the refrigerator for this particular house was on the front porch. Another firefighter was able to find the window and go through that window and push the refrigerator out of the way so he could get out of the structure. And then 2 other firefighters found a side window which they were able to get out of, but not before calling a second mayday. So, lessons you take away from that is we've done research on fires that start on the exterior, and the guidance has been that you've got to apply water to the exterior first and take care of that fire before going interior, because you can't affect that fire on the outside from the interior. And so that maybe the first line or having a second line going sooner to get that fire on the exterior would have prevented the siding from burning and failing the window into the bedroom and causing the bedroom to flash over, which trapped the firefighters in the building and caused a tremendous amount of heat generated for them as well, thermal exposure. Another thing with regard to fireground decision making, and we're seeing this in some other line of duty, our near miss instance that we're currently working on, is fire officers see the fire outside extending out of a window, and that's known information. They know that. And at that point in time, they know the distance between their fire engine and that fire. They know where their firefighters are. They've got good accountability because they haven't entered the building yet. But they make assumptions about what's going on in the building. And they're making assumptions that they can't possibly know, right? They don't know what the fuel load is in the building. They may have a good idea of the layout of the apartment if they've been to those apartments before, maybe. They don't exactly know what the fire conditions are in the building or the structural stability in the building. But I think one piece of guidance is that if they take a short tactical pause, look at what they've got on the exterior, and maybe flow some water prior to making entry, whatever unknown they're going to encounter after that point is going to be easier to deal with. In this particular case, if they had knocked that fire from the exterior, when they went inside, even though they had a longer stretch than they thought they had, that wouldn't have been a big deal because the bedroom isn't on the verge of flashover, right? The fire's not spreading faster than they can move or faster than they can respond to it. And I think, as we start looking back at incidents, that there's more of these. And when you talk to the officer, what they say makes sense. We thought it was like 30 seconds and we'd be in there and have it out. Why would we take that extra time to drag the hose along the side of the house and flow water on the fire? But as it turned out, in this case, it took more than 30 seconds to get to the fire and put it out, right? And there are other scenarios that we're working on which are similar, where the officer thought this was going to be a quick hit, be done, and then they found out that the layout was different than they thought. There were heavier smoke conditions than they thought. It was hotter than they thought. And now they're in the building 5 minutes, 8 minutes, and they don't have water on the fire. And their firefighters are getting hot, and the fire's getting bigger due to the ventilation that they're making from the front door and whatnot. And so it's a different way of thinking, maybe. I think in hazmat, when you train people in hazmat, that they kind of deal with the knowns first, and then they address the unknown issues. And maybe that's the kind of thought process we need to help fire officers handle on the fire ground to make some better decisions to help them be more effective. And I mean, one of the challenges with this is that probably 90% of the time, the assumption works, right? So the firefighters have positive feedback. And again, that can be okay to go in that direction, provided you're ready to switch gears and go to plan B, right? If you got a plan B locked and loaded, like, well, if it's not what we expect, we're going to pull back, get on the radio and say, what's going on outside? Or we're just going to pull back and reconfigure this ourselves, depending on who's on scene. But many times we see that if plan A isn't working, there's a continuation to try to make plan A work instead of, again, sort of taking a tactical pause and saying, what's really going on here? Have you guys seen that? Does that make sense to you?
So to align with what you're talking about, we've been doing a lot of work with some of the Project Mayday data. And that information is very clear that roughly 70% of the time with our paid departments that are participating in the project, 70% of the time, they either have an incomplete or they did not do their 360. But the problem with that is like what you're saying, the default strategy that we go to 93% of the time is still offensive. So we don't have a big picture of what's going on. We see a few little bits of information and we default to that offensive strategy and go with the tactics that we've always used. So that matches up exactly with what you're saying.
Yeah, Dan, I think something that we're up against is I mean, we're winning, I think, and people are realizing slowly but surely, we maybe need to look at things different, and our environment's changing and all of that. But we're up against, some other people who are out there saying it is all worth the risk, and you don't need to worry about that. So, the more that we're sending that message of we want people to make decisions, and then training those people who make decisions to actually understand the tactical considerations and what they're really looking at. And that it doesn't hurt a thing to put a splash of water through that window in that bedroom to buy yourself a little bit of time to make it better. Yeah. And I think that all circles back around to another piece of deployment. And we've talked about this for the last 6 months. The only fire department that's the FDNY in the United States is the FDNY. They're pulling up with, massive resources. So when you're pulling up with 7 people and that's all you got for 10 minutes, you have to do some things differently. So you have to deploy a little bit differently. And people need to have that understanding that one size doesn't fit all. Just recently, we're working with an organization that is a blue card fire department that had fire in the basement. There is no windows. It's a newer building, lightweight construction, not a significant fire, but the fire was underneath the stairs. They'd gotten some water onto the fire. As they're exiting the building, they have a 100% stair collapse. The stairs are the only way out of the building because the fire was, for the most part, extinguished. It is really the only reason that they were able to exit the building. But a lot of the things you talked about with the lightweight construction, the failure for them to be able to even see what was going on, it was basically just a connection point had burned through that caused the stair collapse. Once 2 firefighters got, 500 pounds of, with them fully dressed on that stair trying to get back out. And the fire was, indeed extinguished, but it resulted in multiple maydays with 4 firefighters trapped in the basement. And the after action of that, as we're working through it with them and helping them understand exactly what happened, is you might not see some of those things, but you can't operate on something that you don't know what you're operating on top of. And that's what they're coming up with, themselves.
We've done a lot of work with Pete Van Dorp, and Pete Van Dorp retired as the director of training from the Chicago Fire Department. And then he went on to have a second career as chief of Algonquin Lake in the Hills, a suburban Chicago fire department. And one of the things that he started with us early on. He's been working with us probably a good 15 years or so. And so he came up with a couple things that he teaches. One is, when you roll up on a fire, assume a vent limited fire and lightweight construction until you can determine otherwise. But you should operate with those assumptions in mind. And the other thing that he mentioned with regard to the lightweight construction, again, to try to give a hook for the firefighter's imagination, if you will, is that what the industry did is they replaced mass with math, right? So they were able to shave pounds off of a joist by using math, which again, under non-fire conditions works wonderfully well. Excellent designs and good for the consumer. But when it's unprotected, it's not protected by a sprinkler. It's not protected by gypsum board. When it's unprotected and exposed to fire, it's going to fail pretty quickly.
In your opinion, why do you think the fire service is so reticent to look at the studies, understand what's going on, learn the lessons from the scientific side of it, as opposed to us having to consistently learn the lessons the hard way? Near misses, line of duty deaths. Why can't we just look at the science and say this makes sense?
It's not science. That's the challenge, I guess. Maybe it's culture. At one time in my past life, I was a security guard, and at the time it was in somewhat of an upscale suburban shopping mall that, in the big scheme of things, didn't have a lot of trouble. So you're getting training, right? And what were we security guards waiting for? We're waiting for somebody to steal something so that we can go after them. I think the fire service is kind of the same way. You're training, and you want to use that training. You want to show your skill. You want to show your mastery of that skill. I mean, you guys could speak to this. You may have been there at some point in your life as well, but when the fire call goes, that's what you've been waiting for. And this idea of, well, I'm not going to use all my training because reality tells me that floor is going to fall away any moment. I've got to go in there and try. I guess how do you bridge that gap? How do you get that understanding across that? No, we are gonna size this up. We're gonna evaluate it, and we're gonna make the attack that makes the most sense. We want to get in there. We're going to get in there to search. We're going to get in there to see if anybody's there for rescue. We're going to get in there and put the fire out. But if we don't take the right steps, we're going to fail at that, because once the firefighter goes down, then everything else is off the table, rightfully so. So you've got to prevent that in order to do your job.
Looking at everything that you've done, from everything up to, Governor's Island in 2012, you had a lot of laboratory tests. And then from 2012, you've done everything, lots of acquired structures from houses, multifamily residential. You've done some strip centers, some commercials, the search and rescue. How do you deal with the people that say, when they look at the science and they look at the information, the flowing water from the outside, that somehow this makes you less than, that your application of this information makes you not an aggressive firefighter? My belief is quite the opposite, because if you have a better understanding of the dynamics and the behavior, then you can make better decisions on the fire ground and address those things. How do you guys deal with it as you continue to teach and put this information out, that they align this somehow with something lesser than what we are signed up for in the fire service?
Well, and I mean, our lane, if you will, is basically providing the science, right? Our lane is not to tell people how to fight fires, but provide them with the information so they can make decisions, perhaps hopefully better decisions. Because as it was mentioned, I guess Josh mentioned earlier, it depends on the resources that you have, right? Are you showing up with one engine that's going to be there for the first 20 minutes before help comes? Or, are you showing up with multiple engines and ladder companies and a rescue company? That all makes a difference to your approach in some regard. It makes a difference to how fast you can collect information. But in the same manner, if you've got 36 to 40 people showing up in a few minutes, perhaps it also makes it more difficult to coordinate those actions as well. Where if you've got one engine company, you should be able to coordinate that, pretty well. So there are certainly a lot of factors that come into it. And I would like to believe, although I know it's not true, but allow me the fantasy that most firefighters aren't looking at the data anymore and saying, oh, this is just to make us outside firefighters or something like that. NFPA 1700 is the first guide to structural firefighting that's been released not only in the United States, but predominantly North America, but there were some European members on the committee as well. And I think that there were some really good advantages to that process. Once 1700 was announced that it was going to come into being and it was unknown, there were a number of people on social media that indicated that, like, this is the end of the fire service as we know it. This is all terrible. This is disaster. And to some of those people who are vocal on social media's credit, they actually sent in comments to the committee. And I'll be honest, their comments were very good, and the committee took them to heart. There was discussion about, the book really doesn't talk about tasks, and yet in the scope, it had tasks included. And there's a recommendation that, hey, stick to the strategy and tactics because that's what you're covering. And there were some other recommendations, and out of the recommendations, one was the definition of strategies. shortcutting prior to 1700, I would say it's pretty fair that if your strategies were defined by where you were standing. So if you were going to be standing outside, then that was a defensive strategy. If you were going to be using tactics inside, then it's an offensive strategy. And what 1700, I believe, clarified is, what is your plan? What is your incident action plan? What is your intent? If your intent is to operate on the interior, then that is an offensive strategy. And as part of an offensive strategy, you may use a tactic of applying water from the exterior en route or during your interior operations as part of that offensive strategy. So it's not really a transition from, oh, I put water in the window for 10 seconds and I'm going to transition from defensive to offensive. That's nonsense, right? It's all part of an offensive strategy. Similarly, there are buildings today that are so huge that you might be defending an exposure and actually be in the fire building. So again, from a defensive perspective, the definitions are better. What is your intent? And I think, 1700 is not perfect. It's a first shot, and pieces will evolve. But there's a lot of good information in there, and a lot of good definitions were developed, as well as with ideas about how your turnout gear works, to have some better understanding of that. What can it protect you from or not? It doesn't make you fireproof. History of the research that's gone on to support the guidance that's provided. And I think most importantly, it brought the research results, melded them with experience of a lot of fire chiefs and fire officers from big cities and small cities, so that they could make some recommendations on different occupancies and how different water application or ventilation techniques have worked for them. So that melding of the experience and the research results, I think, is pretty powerful.
Dan, a million years ago, we did that critical factors thing with the commercial building and then the little lightweight roof structures with tile. The third piece of that is we went and talked to ER docs, and we showed them the test results from the commercial burn. And both of them were surprised by it, to say the least. And they made the comment, they said, we had no clue it happened this fast. And we were under the impression that, like, your smoke detector goes off, the fire department gets there, and they end up saving your life. Well, both of these doctors said, no, based off what you showed us, you're dead. There's no saving anybody. See, what they understood were the clinical implications of being killed by the products of combustion. And they went on to describe, they said, you don't have a good outcome. As when you die from the fire, you're not coming back. There's no way to save you. So we believe in kind of this fairy tale that when we go to bed at night, the fire department's protecting us against fire. And they said, that's just simply not true. And I think that's part of this is we talk about, well, do you show up with 4? Do you show up with 24? But the reality is it don't make a goddamn bit of difference if you've been in a building where the fire's been burning for 10 minutes before any of them got there. If you're not behind a door, you're going to die, period. And I think the more we push that out, that's where you get the reply back is, oh, no, we're the last best chance. My dad talked about that, and he says, this is why we search the way we do. We're the last best chance. Well, the doctor said the chance was over. It's done. So we really have to make sense of what we're going to do when we get there and sizing the thing up more accurately than we are, because that will kind of build whatever actions you're going to take. Shit, how long ago was that? It's got to be coming up on 20 years ago, but maybe even longer. So this shit hasn't. Pete Van Dorp, I mean, we're going back to the original. In fact, the thing I popped into my mind is what happened to James Dalton. Where did Dalton go?
He went back to the field.
So he has just been eaten by the Chicago Fire Department. He's truly an engineer now. He is no longer an educated architect. He runs the kitty at Station 87 somewhere.
That's also an example of leadership, how the change of one leader in a fire department can make a difference in what happens within that fire department, and whether ideas about research and things like that are supported within that fire department. So when Ray Orozco got promoted out of the fire department and into a higher level within the city of Chicago, things changed.
Or they went back to the way they had been.
Now, Chicago's an interesting case because the way they had, if we kind of think about this as a pendulum swinging, if you will, that some departments, when they got full turnout gear, did not carry on the lessons of their forefathers because they didn't need to. And they maybe lost some understanding during that generation. They may have lost some understanding of fire behavior that had been understood in large part by the fire service earlier because they had to. The fire service had to change the environment before they could go in if they didn't have an SCBA, if they didn't have full bunker gear. And then we got to a period where, you know what? It's not post flashover yet. I can be in here. And I can be in here for a while, and I'm getting a little warm. I'm sweating a little bit, but, you know, my respiratory tract is protected and this gear is absorbing the thermal energy, and so far, so good. And during that time, housing construction changed and our fuel loads changed, even though plastics have been in our home again for 50 years. The amount of them, I mean, it's all, you know, has changed dramatically. And then you had fires that could develop fast enough and hot enough to start to overwhelm the capabilities of the turnout gear. And then it was, oh, well, like in Houston, we need more turnout gear. We need thicker, better turnout gear. And again, that will extend your operational time, safe operational time for a little bit. But once it's overwhelmed and that gear has absorbed heat, you're going to get hot and it's going to drive you out of there. There's no turning back till you cool off and dump the heat out of that gear. So Chicago was very late to the game in getting bunker gear. It was, I think, the fall of 2006 or 2007 when they actually got bunker gear. I think they're one of the last big departments in the United States to make that transition. But what did that mean? That meant that up to that point, they still had to cool before they went in. They have an operating procedure for blitz attack that if they roll up on a 2.5-story wood frame and it's got fire blowing out of it, they'll hit it with the deck gun first and then go in. So maybe Chicago really didn't have to embrace a small change because that's something that they were doing the whole time. They never gave it up. Where other departments, you know, the booster lines went off, various other things changed, and people just stopped doing it without any real consideration. I remember when we did that training session for the division chiefs in Houston, and there were a number of chiefs there that had about 40 years on the job. And they stood up during the training and said, you know, one day we showed up and the booster reels were gone. And then they were like, hell, we put out a lot of fire with those booster reels. And there was no training. There was no discussion. It's just they're gone. We go to Boston. You know, Boston has done a lot of training, and there was some discussion with some of their senior folks that had been on the job 30 years or so. And when they had fire engines that had an open cab, it was common practice for the engineer from the driver's seat to go into pump mode and operate the deck gun on a triple decker while the firefighters are stretching line and going to make entry. Then they showed up and an open cab wasn't a safe thing anymore. And they got enclosed cabs and the engines got bigger, and it was no longer an easy task for the engineer to operate the deck gun. So it just stopped. So it's things like this that kind of just happen that people don't appreciate the impact down the road. And so really the pendulum's just swinging back to say, hey, this idea of knocking the fire down, softening the target, whatever you want to call it, resetting the fire, they call it in Oklahoma City. It's just another tool, and it shouldn't be discarded. It shouldn't be thought of as a tool of weakness. It's actually a tool of strength. You're trying to enable the search inside. You're trying to enable going deeper inside, going faster inside. That's what it's all about.
You know, Dan, it would be interesting if you guys did some test about that, where you could show two different tactical approaches. Because if you do it correctly, it takes half the time. Then if you fight your way in and now you're falling through stairs and all the rest of it. So just kind of modeling different effective tactics for the front end. Because like you say, any water that you could put in ahead of time is going to reduce the back end of it significantly. It just is. And then the risk throughout the thing goes down for everyone in it. I think those kind of things actually demonstrate. It's like, okay, you think your shit works well? Here you go over here. We're going to do it the right way over here and see. And then if you even follow that up with like, okay, here's your exposure. And then here's what the secondary damage was for the thing. So even from a property loss standpoint, the modern approach buys you, I don't know, 20% less destruction or whatever it would be. But that would be an interesting way to kind of present that.
So in our one of the next near miss that we'll be coming out with, we did run fire dynamic simulator models of the event as it occurred, what would have happened if exterior water was applied sooner, what would have happened if the interior attack was successful, and what would have happened if a door control or a smoke control curtain was used. This is a fire in a garden apartment. So we're looking at with regard to protecting the common stairway. So I think you'll see some of that. We talked earlier before we started the program about the need for you guys to do a whole show on our search and rescue project. Keith Stakes and Craig Weinshank ran that. And I think you'll find where they did out of the 21 experiments they've done so far, comparisons like that, where firefighters made entry through a window to effect a search. And if they didn't control the bedroom door, let's say, which is across the hall from a room that's in post flashover, within a relatively short period of time, the bedroom that the firefighters entered is now also post flashover. If they can control the door quickly, they cut that off. Having the window open starts an exchange of smoke that's trapped in the room and fresh air, so conditions get better. Similarly, if the first line goes to that room that's on fire and knocks that fire down, then pretty much any kind of entry that's made or search that's made or opening that's made post knockdown is starting now to clear the building of smoke and make things better, because there is an issue of, okay, if you find that person to rescue, where do you take them? And they found that, under certain conditions, typically pre-suppression makes a big difference if you lift them up in the air versus like dragging them close to the floor with regard to the toxic gas that's there and the heat that's there. Or lifting them to a window ledge, for example, is going to provide an increased exposure if that window is in full exhaust and the fire's not out yet, or at least not reduced yet. So, I think you could do a whole show on that you'll see some of these comparisons and back and forth.
Smoke detectors should be changed, and they should be put at doors, and they automatically close the door. That will be the next thing.
It's interesting that, in this tragedy that happened earlier this year in New York in the high-rise building, where door closers are required, that still seems to be a challenge. It's happened before. Not only in New York, but other places. And the challenge with that for Americans is, what prevents somebody from putting their television stand in front of their door because they need the room, or, they need the space, or a big stuffed teddy bear, or whatever it is. And that's where, when you look at automatic fire sprinklers, they're not perfect, but they can cover a wide range of sins. It's harder for clever people, and maybe non-clever people can defeat anything. It's something that more often tends to be left alone, just in the ceiling by itself. We know in some ways we know the answer, and then it's really a question of economics and free will.
Have you guys discovered anywhere where water is bad at building fires?
The water itself, no. There are times when, if the flow path is set up correctly and water is being used ineffectively, that you can create a pressure to push heat out of the room of origin and downstream. But generally, no. Water is a very good agent. Water has great properties for absorbing heat. And when used effectively, it's a great thing. Another thing that's sort of evolved over the past year and a half has been the hose stream mechanics prop. I don't know if you've seen that. Mm-hmm. It's basically a hallway with plexiglass on the upper part of the walls, and then it opens up into a room that's 90 degrees to the hallway. It goes that next step of training that we think is really, that's the baby right there. Yeah. That's really needed, because surprising to me, when we have firefighters with experience come and they look at where the water's going, it's not necessarily where they thought they were applying water when they're able to actually see it and see where the momentum takes it, and how if they don't have a steep angle, they're not breaking the stream and distributing the water around, or how much air they can entrain by moving a smooth bore or having a narrow fog nozzle going down the hall. And again, if you have a vent ahead of you, that entrainment is great. Absolutely, you want to use it. But there are some cases, if you don't have that vent, but you want to get water down there, where you don't want to be entraining a lot of air. Or if you're making an exterior attack, you don't want to entrain a lot of air. It's able to show the EVE attack methodology for exterior fires getting up in the attic, or if you're just approaching an attic fire. So it really is, I would say it's probably, in my biased view, one of the best firefighter training props that has come out probably in the past generation, if not longer. And I think it's way overdue and a much needed thing for firefighters to understand where their water's going and how to use it most effectively. And again, there are seasoned, FSRI isn't just making this stuff up. We've got, seasoned firefighters that have been in the business a long time, 25, 30 years, and they're telling us about how to bank the water off the king post or the door jamb to start cooling the fire room down before you actually get the 20 feet down the hallway to get there. And the fact that, Keith was able to work with them and evolve, this prop so that people can actually see it, I think is incredible. And most firefighters that see it or use it have a similar feeling like, wow, this is, we need to train with this. We need to demonstrate this to our people. FDNY has one now. I believe there's about 20 of them across the country. LA County has one. We've got one at the Ohio State Training Academy, the Connecticut State Training Academy, Portland Fire Department, the Utah State Training Academy. I know they're using one this week down in Florida at the Water on the Fire Conference. So there's a number of them being built and used around the United States. There's, I think, one or two in New York, upstate New York. Really a valuable tool. The other thing is we, have given boot camps and other things around that the flow path props and or lighting a piece of upholstered furniture. I mean, I've got hundreds of videos of burning furniture, many of them that I show to firefighters all the time. And somehow, it's a video. It just doesn't carry the same impact as when they see an upholstered chair ignited and how fast the fire grows and how much smoke is generated and how much heat is generated. And it astounds me that how they can be so impressed with that when they've been fighting, many of them been fighting fire for 10, 20, 30 years, but they've never seen that part of the fire. They're always kind of dealing with the tail end. So maybe it's that kind of education, continued education, that helps give firefighters the appreciation of why it's so important to size up and work with the known information that they have, and then continue their offensive strategy.
When you look at the fire schools, the academies that these folks are going through, and, you're talking 400, 450 hours that they may be participating in. That small piece that is tied to the fire science is 4 to 5 hours. It's a very tiny block, and it's really old school kind of rudimentary stuff that's not really applicable with today's stuff, today's information. So that's a huge piece we got to try to change.
I'm sure that a large percentage of fire departments still teach vertical ventilation and reading roofs and walking the strength of the thing, which the peak used to be, and all that. It's like a narrative that's just handed down from one generation to another. And that's really kind of the cultural piece I think you're trying to overcome in the whole thing. And it's hard because you have somebody who's educated and understands it and is a scientist who is competing with some kind of an ancient Yoda figure to these people. And so it's like, no, that wasn't completely correct what they taught. Well, they're done that. And they're like, well, no, you go away. I'm not. It just becomes harder. And I think what Jeff said is right, is we don't spend 10% of a recruit firefighter's time teaching them about the fire. It's about all the other stuff they're going to end up doing. Starting off to become a firefighter, you don't get enough education in the fire part of it. And then when you promote, it's just what you learn from the time that they didn't train you properly to then. So, I mean, it's just, and what's odd is that's our identity. So when you look at, I mean, the comment I kept making is everything that we do, all the services that we're the worst at is the structural firefighting because it's the one that's unregulated. It's left to us. But that doesn't happen on the EMS side. You brought up hazmat. It doesn't happen there. We're the ones that fix that. Inside the service is where hazmat came from. The TRT is the same thing. So all those disciplines that we do are done basically using the scientific method until you get to fire suppression. One of the first things we did where you're presenting at Notre Dame or wherever it was, one of Henry's guys who has, a doctorate in computerology, you're talking fire science, and he bumps me, he says, didn't they teach this to you guys in high school? This is where I learned all this stuff. And they're arguing with them. And he says, we didn't argue with the science teacher because they knew more than we did. And well, there's a reason you're not a firefighter, is they stuffed you in trash cans during that part of your life. So this is where we are today. Yeah.
Dan, thank you so much for everything you do for the fire service and for being here today to share your knowledge with us. We'll keep calling on you to do more and more and to continue to share. And we'll certainly get together with Keith and Craig and find out a little more about the search and rescue project so we can share that with all the B shifters as well. Just about every episode, we do a timeless tactical truth. There's a deck of cards written by Bruno. And there's 52 of them, of course, and we shuffle the deck and pull out a timeless tactical truth. So I'll pull one out, I'll read it, and if you can chime in on it, and then anybody else on the show today can also add their 2 cents as well. So shuffling the deck, and today's card is the 10 of spades, and this one says, use tactical priority benchmarks as the action planning roadmap. Again, use tactical priority benchmarks as the action planning roadmap. What do you think of that?
What that brings to mind for me is Chief Brunacini either sketching on a napkin or on an overhead transparency of a stick figure of a house and the level of fire that's coming out of it, to make your assessment of what is it that you're going to do next. What can you do that's your best action at that point in time? Is it protect the neighbor's house, or is it get in there and limit the spread of the fire that's in that house and search and rescue and whatnot? So that's certainly what that tactical truth brings to mind for me.
And that wraps up this B Shifter podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. We'd like to thank Dan Madrzykowski for being here and getting us updated on what FSRI is up to. And we have some stuff to look forward to, so we'll be able to continue to update you here on B Shifter. If you enjoyed this podcast or at least got something out of it, please subscribe if you haven't already. If you have any comments for any of us or Dan, you can find our information in the show notes. Until next time, thanks so much for listening to B Shifter.